living by faith, or really living by a principle, the principle of faith. That's what we want to discuss, this particular principle. Faith, what does it really mean? And we want to look at the difference between two very significant components. You see, the heavenly character, we understand, must be acquired here on earth, or it cannot be acquired at all. It's only here on earth. And the only character that we develop here on earth is the one that will actually last through eternity. That's the one that we really take with us. So this is a serious, heart-searching matter that we want to look at today. That's what we actually take with us to heaven. It won't change. So in light of that, it's very important for us as Christians to understand and realize, what is this principle? What is really required of us here on earth? What is this living by faith really all about? Because it has to do with our character, our attitude, and what we develop. That's really what we're exploring. That's where that's what we're examining. We'll turn in our Bibles to Galatians chapter 2. This is a familiar passage, but in Galatians 2 and verse 20, this is what we're told by the Apostle Paul. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So it's one of those times where Paul is speaking about the message of salvation, and he applies it to himself very personally. So Paul here says that he now lives by something. It's the faith of the Son of God. Now, this is the characteristic of the Christian. He lives by faith. We need to examine what it means when it says that we are to live by faith. Another passage that we want to look at as well is in Romans chapter 1. And we'll compare those two, and we lay a foundation for what we'll be covering today. Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation, to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed, from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. So, here is the characteristic of those people who are believers in the plan of salvation. The Bible describes them as living by faith. Now, what does it mean to live by faith? So we need to look at something today, like I said, that will outline for us this principle, this outstanding principle in the Christian's life that is characterized for his walk, that is living by faith or living by this principle. Let's go to another familiar passage to link all those together. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6. But without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Okay, so these three passages we're putting together. Paul says he lives by the faith of the Son of God. He says the Christian or the just shall live by faith. And now we're giving a description about this faith where we're told without this faith, it is impossible to please God. Without faith, it's impossible to please him. So when we live by faith, we are pleasing God. The inverse is also true. But the important principle here to focus on is this overriding principle that overrules a Christian's life is to please God. Like I said, the inverse is also true. The opposite is also true, because what Satan presents is to please self and the desire to please self. And the introduction of sin into this world, this is actually what happened. We want to look at the counterfeit here and see what did sin introduce into the world, so we can see how can we correctly come back to this principle and therefore develop this heavenly character. Now, the story of the Garden of Eden and what happened there in Genesis chapter 3, I want to just review this component in Genesis chapter 3 and see what Eve actually did that will help us to understand this counterfeit that has a lot of people deceived today. Genesis 3, verse 6, the woman and the serpent conversing. It says, and when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired, to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. So, familiar story, sad story, but this was the introduction of sin into the world. Now notice, sin introduced a very strange and new principle. Now this was a principle, this was a departure actually from trusting in God, pleasing God. It was turning the attention to self. There are three things here that Eve did that tells us there was a selfish motivation that she moved from. And this is really what caused her to ultimately eat from the tree. If you look at it closely, it says the first thing, she saw that the tree was good for food. So she used her eyes. Now God has blessed us with all our senses. She used her sense of sight to determine something. And then she also found and noticed that it was pleasant to the eyes when she looked at it. And then finally, the last thing, it was desired to make one wise. Now notice, all these things have a focus on self. Eve desired something. She wanted something for herself. And this is the introduction of sin. Sin has introduced this principle of seeking to satisfy self, whereas prior to that, the whole universe ran harmoniously. Even every being sought actually to please God, the creator of life, the provider and sustainer. So at the very outset, at the beginning of everything, sin introduced this principle of not God, but me. And so the woman selfishly chose to eat from that tree that she thought would make her wise. And we know the story, what resulted, what happened. Sin introduced something. It introduced self. It brought self prominently to the front. And how self comes prominently to the front was demonstrated or manifested through the senses or feelings of Eve, through her sense of sight and through her desire to please self. So we're going to see this counterfeit to this principle and living by faith is really feelings that are perverted by sin. When we make them the primary way to live, which is basically the way everybody lives, when we make that the primary way to live, it actually has a direct impact on our attitude, our journey, our experience, and our character that we develop. So we'll look at another example of this as well. A few thousand years later, a very similar example, and this is from the Gospels in John chapter 20, where we have the story of Thomas. And in looking at the story of Thomas, we will see what Thomas did that we can learn from regarding this principle, living by faith, and the counterfeit to that. Beginning with verse 24 in John chapter 20 and verse 24. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said unto him, We have seen the Lord. But he said unto them, Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. And after 8 days, again his disciples were within, and Thomas with them. Then came Jesus, and doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and said, Peace be unto you. Then saith he to Thomas, Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless, but believing. Very significant story. Thomas made it a condition that he will not believe unless his senses were satisfied. So he based his faith on feeling, on senses. He says, unless I see with my eyes, unless I feel with my hands, then, only then will I believe. Now, a lot of people today, Christians even, fall into this trap subconsciously. Unless we experience a certain feeling or emotion or certain senses, we think that we're not really in faith or in favor with God. We test our faith by our feelings and our emotions. Now, Christ identified how much faith Thomas had here in verse 27. At the end, he told him, and be not faithless, but believing. And so Thomas' method was actually faithless or faithlessness. There was no faith at all. When we base our judgment and our decisions on feelings and emotions, that's how we base our decisions. Christ says that's actually faithlessness. It's faithless. In other words, it's not pleasing to God. Now, we saw earlier that to please God it's impossible without faith. We are to exercise faith in order to please God. That's how we are to live our life. This is the principle. So we see these two sides here. On the one side, we have faith that is pleasing to God. And on the other hand side, we see what sin introduced, that is self and making self first. And that is done by focusing on our feelings and our emotions and our senses. Now, don't get me wrong. God gave us feelings and our emotions and our senses. And Christ in this instance actually used the feelings and senses of Thomas. It says, okay, use your senses, make sure that it's me. But Thomas, actually, that is being faithless. It is not really believing. And he said to him, be not faithless, but believing. So there is a place for the senses, for the feelings, but that place is not the first and foremost place. That is not what we consult to make the basis for believing and understanding the promises of God. They are not resting on feeling. We have a foundation that is very distinct from feeling, as light is from darkness. We have to really learn to move from this principle. We have to operate by faith. That's a principle that is a guiding motivation for the Christian's life. Now, when we learn to do this, we will be able to move understandingly and not be swayed and controlled and subject to the varying emotions that constantly plague us. Now, this is something that is very relevant and of significance for us as Christians, because this is an experience that we can all relate to at one point or another. So these two things, feelings and emotions on the one side, and on the other side, faith, and this is the principle. So this is the counterfeit to faith. We are to live by this principle of faith, and the counterfeit or the distraction or the departure from that is really to live by feelings, emotions, and senses only, and make those the criteria for our spiritual walk. Satan has a counterfeit for everything. So this is why we're looking at those two components. Now, it's only natural for us, because when it comes to feelings and senses, it's only natural for us because these are the only things that we have to give us information about the world that we live in, as far as the physical world. That's how we make decisions. So it's very normal for us as we grow up in this world to depend very strongly on our feelings, on our emotions, on our senses in particular that feed all of that. That's how we survive so far. But we will see how the Christian then lives actually by different principles altogether, a particular different principle altogether, the principle of faith, because he's operating in a world and in a sphere that is not just physical, that is not just visible. And you can't live in that world based on the physical and visible things that we use as far as feelings, senses, and emotions. So this is what we're looking at. So we want to ask ourselves this question. How does this look like practically? That we live by this principle, we live by faith. What does that really mean? And the difference between it and feelings and emotions. It's living by faith. That's how we please God. But I want to look at it in a little bit more detail to apply it practically. And the next verse here is in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 31. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 31. It says, whether therefore ye eat or drink, or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God. Short verse, but very potent. Here we have a very important principle that's introduced. Everything that the Christian does, eating, drinking, whatsoever it might be, must be done to the glory of someone. That someone is not self. It's to the glory of God. Now, normally, naturally, if you're left to our own, we are really in this world brought up and taught to always care for number one. Look out for number one. Number one happens to be me, self. And everybody else, watch out. This is how the world operates. This is the world we grow up in. Sad to say, in the Christian walk, we actually often fall into this trap of how we were before we even became Christians, of how we have been raised and trained in the world. Because, for a Christian, as soon as we start consulting with our feelings, our emotions, our senses, we actually end up focusing on self. And here, this is why this passage is given to us, and this is why we need to see the scope and how much this applies. When Paul says here, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. That really defines a way of living, a principle or a walk or a way of life that is defined by faith. And this is what the contrast is. So whatever we eat, whatever we drink, it's all to someone else's glory other than self. It is to the glory of God. Let's look at another passage, because there are a few of them. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 20, just a little earlier. For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. That's 1 Corinthians 6:20. Again, same thing. We are to glorify God in our body and in our spirit. What is the reason, though, that is given to us in this verse? Because we have been bought with a price. And if we're bought with a price, we owe something. This is what we owe. It's not to serve self. You see, sin has brought and introduced this concept into this world of serving self first. And the whole plan of salvation is designed to bring us back to the point of how it was before, to bring us back to the point where we do not seek to serve self, but to glorify God. And the devil uses our feelings and our emotions and senses against us many of the time to cause us to focus on self and only self. What is this principle that is to characterize our life? Therefore, glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which is God's. This is the principle. Every component of life is to glorify God. Everything else is under that. Now, this is like, it's very all-encompassing. What does that really mean? What does that practically mean when we say to glorify God in all things, in your body and in your spirit? Practically, how can we apply this? What does it look like? What does it mean to really glorify God? We need to understand that, because we're told this is the one principle that is to characterize our life, which is an expression of living by faith. I want to keep it practical here. A good place to look for an answer to this question is someone who did glorify God in their life is, of course, the example given to us by Christ himself. In John chapter 17, we have Jesus Christ himself setting for us this example, and we learn from him what he did practically, which gives us an illustration of how we can apply the same principle in our life today. John 17 and verse 4, Jesus says, I have glorified thee on the earth. I have finished the work which thou gavest me to do. So Christ said this at the end of his ministry on earth. And if you look throughout the whole, if you find through the book of John, many times Jesus says, I speak the words of my Father, I do the works of my Father. In all his life, Christ lived by this one principle of glorifying God, which is a manifestation of living by faith. That's what governed his life. He practiced this principle practically and repeatedly in his life, in everything he did. And we're going to see the real test for that in a minute. But God's glory was foremost in his life. And of course, he concluded his mission by stating that, says, I have done that, a mission accomplished. And his mission was to glorify God. Even the carrying out the plan of salvation, delivering man from sin and all of that was to glorify God. That was pleasing to God. So I want to put all these things together that we're finding. Living by faith, this is our principle. Without it, we can't please God. It's the faith of the Son of God. We looked at the verse in Romans, the just shall live by faith, putting all these aspects and principles together and looking how Christ applied it practically in his life. And we want to look at the practical application for us today as well. We have to understand something about how the devil works, because when we adopt a principle and we choose to live by that principle, especially if that principle is of heavenly origin, the devil will do everything he can to challenge that principle. And he will bring us into situations that are designed to challenge that principle and the application of that principle in order to test us. Now, of course, he hopes that we will give up on that principle and give in and throw it all in. So this principle that characterized the life of Christ, do you think the devil challenged that principle for Christ and tried to cause Christ to waver from that principle? Most definitely, yes. And in order for us to see this principle in its strongest action and manifestation, we need to examine the time when Christ was most severely tried and tested, because it's in the trials that the principle truly is manifested or lost. Or this is where you can see the contest really clearly. So if we turn to the life of Christ and think, when was the time when he was the most tried, the most severely tried and tested? And usually if you think about it, you'll find that it has to do with the closing scenes of his life, particularly in the Garden of Gethsemane. In the Garden of Gethsemane was tried severely, so much so that he actually says, Father, I really do not want to go through this. I do not want to drink this cup. I do not feel like I can take it. And in Gethsemane, 3 times, Christ uttered for us this particular principle of how he actually lived, what he lived by. He taught us and he showed us what it means to actually glorify God 3 times, because he said it in conjunction with when he expressed how he felt, but he didn't give in to that. But he actually said, not my will, but thy will be done. He said that to the Father 3 times. And the devil tried him very strongly to turn him aside from this principle. But every time it happened, Christ was so severely tempted to give up, to give in. And in this struggle, he still maintained his integrity of glorifying God. And he tells us in so many words what that actually means. It is allowing whose will to rule? God's will to rule, not his will. He says, not my will, but thy will be done. So in essence, if you analyze what was happening there, Christ was going through the struggle. He was expressing the struggle of how he felt, his feelings, his senses, and his emotions, and then actually choosing to go by something else, to actually live by faith. And in choosing to live by faith, he was glorifying God. And how that manifested was by choosing God's will. He surrendered his will, his senses, his feelings, his emotions to God's will. Here's all of these things in a very clear demonstration. So Christ, if you put it in other words, Christ was basically self-surrendered. He was fully surrendered. In his most trying hour, he practiced self-surrender. And that is what he meant when he says, I have glorified thee on the earth. So in other words, to live by this principle of glorifying God, which is this one overriding principle, it means, according to Christ's example, it is to surrender self. That is the most important thing that we can actually understand. Self-surrender is really the substance of all of the teachings of Christ. You realize that? The surrender of self. Now, why is that? Because this is what sin introduced at the very beginning. And this is what Christ came to deliver us from, the rulership of self, where Eve departed in the Garden of Eden from pleasing God to pleasing self. And this is what man needs to be restored back to, self-surrender. And this is the means. Christ demonstrated that in his life on earth by glorifying the Father when he was here on earth. This is how we can also be brought back from this counterfeit that the devil introduced with the introduction of sin. So now we have this practical understanding of what it means in this particular instance to glorify God. It is when we surrender ourselves and say, as Christ said, not my will, but thy will be done. Now, this, like I said, is the most important thing that defines Christianity, that the gospel is to bring about. And you see it very clearly in the life of Christ. Christ did it. He went through it for a reason, on our behalf, not just to show us that it can be done, but so that he can deliver us from that enslavement of self. So his whole teachings, all the teachings of Christ are really designed to have this same theme, to drive home to us the importance of self-surrender. Now, I can't say that enough, but this is in stark contrast with what sin says, because sin says, my way, not God's way. But according to this principle that Christ is demonstrating here, we have a totally different understanding. It's not my way, but it's your will. Let your will be done. So we live by his will and we seek his glory. And so this is how we are to live. This is what living by faith is really all about. Let's look at another verse. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 13, we are also given this beautiful promise that is relevant here. For it is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. So, a familiar passage, beautiful passage, but here it is. When we surrender our lives to Christ, God works in us to do 2 things, to will and to do of his good pleasure. And we saw earlier, what is it that gives pleasure to God? Without faith, it is impossible to please him. So here we're really talking about the same thing. To bring us to that point, God works in us to will. So whose will then is it exercised when we will and do his good pleasure? It is really his will, but it must be because we have surrendered our will. In other words, God works with us. God pleads with our hearts until we reach a point where we will, where we decide, when we choose to surrender. And then God's working then in our will. And He's working in us to do this because we have self-surrendered to will and to do His good pleasure. And when God does this, it will be carrying out His will, His glory. It's living by faith. His name is then actually glorified in our lives. We end up doing His good pleasure. That is pleasing to God. So, as we look at all these components together, I want to look at how this actually happens and how important it is for that to happen, even though we might think that we have done this some time ago, perhaps in our experience. Now, as we're going through this, I really want us to examine our hearts, each and every one of us, because we need to ask ourselves this question: am I today, not 6 months ago, not 3 years ago, when I was baptized, but am I today living by this one principle that is pleasing to God, that characterizes the Christian walk, living by faith? Am I living by that faith that pleases God and glorifies Him? In other words, am I fully self-surrendered to God? Am I carrying out His will, not mine? Because unless this takes place, brothers and sisters, we really end up carrying with us the same evil of self that ends up destroying our happiness and poisons our Christian walk. I think it goes without saying, but I'll say, not everybody who professes to be a Christian is really truly walking the Christian walk as God intends. There's many false professors. A good way to check things, or a good thing to do, is not try and see who is or who isn't. The good thing to really do is examine our own hearts. Are we like that? Are you happy? Are you at peace in your experience, in your walk as a Christian? Or are you not very happy? These are questions to ask for the purpose of heart examination. And if not, you need to search your heart. You need to really examine, how am I living? You see, is it possible to be a follower of Christ and profess to be a believer and not be fully surrendered? Now, the answer, of course, is yes. There are many people who are like that. Many professors claim all kinds of things. So just because you claim to be a Christian, and even if you've been baptized, does not really guarantee anything. Doesn't guarantee anything for me either. We need to examine our hearts daily, today. Are we living by this principle that we're to live by faith, or not? If in any way this is you, this is something you really need to ask, you need to examine. Is this me? Heart examination. Why? Because we're so close, brothers and sisters. We're so close to the end of all things, to the time when everything will be wrapped up, and we see that. And it would be woeful for us to approach that time thinking all is well and not realizing that there is actually a problem. There is 5 foolish virgins that fell asleep in the parable of Jesus. These 5 foolish virgins were with the wise. They made the same profession. They had the same claims. They even rejoiced in hearing the truth as the parable represents. But there was something lacking. So let us beware of that, because there are so many people, sadly, who profess to be followers of Christ, who have actually never died to self. If you consider that, that is such an alarming thing. It's such a serious thing. So heart examination is important. Dying to self is the essence of the gospel. If you profess to be a Christian and you're not really living by this principle, then you have an experience that does not match the profession that you are making. And no wonder then that you see so many people, they look at Christians and say, well, I don't want anything to do with that. Perhaps we are our own worst enemies for the spreading of God's truth by the way that we are living, because perhaps we have not truly died to self. Maybe at one point or another, but somewhere along the line, lo and behold, we're no longer living by this principle of walking by faith, surrendering self, choosing God's will and God's glory above all the other things that come in through feelings, senses, and emotions that the devil uses many times. So our profession and our experience have to match. If they don't match up, we have an issue, we have a problem. God is not really pleased and happy with us when we are in conflict, in contradiction. Meaning, it's not that he's upset with us, but it's not pleasing to God, for one. And two, God is not happy for us to be in this conflict, in this contradiction. God wants us to be settled one way or another. As a matter of fact, he tells Laodicea, you're lukewarm. I wish you were cold or hot. I can work with you if you're cold or you're hot. I can do something. But if you're in the middle, you're in this conflict, you're neither here nor there. You think you're one thing, but in reality you're another. That doesn't satisfy or help anyone. It ends up being a deception. So that's something that's of vital importance to examine. Now, I know this might be a repetition for some of you, it might be new, but we need to understand this principle. It's a daily thing. It's not just something that happened a long time ago and that's it. So this surrender of self, this one thing above all others, this is what we are to do. Is this a hard thing to do? Is it a hard thing to die to self, to surrender self? Now, the answer, of course, is yes. The warfare against self is actually the greatest battle that was ever fought. This is really the battle. The surrender of self, giving all to God, actually requires a severe struggle. But that is the only thing, brothers and sisters, that has to happen before we can actually renewed and transformed to be in God's image. This is really where the whole great controversy is, as far as we're concerned, personally and individually. We might know things, we might know information, we might understand doctrine and all these other things, but it comes down to a heart surrender, and this is in the deep recesses of our hearts. This is what it's all about. It's a struggle. It's not an easy thing. It's not an impossible task, though. Just because it's a struggle and it's not easy doesn't mean it's impossible or it's unaccomplished. The only thing that's impossible about it, or that's difficult about it, is that self does not want to die. Self does not want to be surrendered. Self fights, self resists day by day. And self, sometimes it's like self doesn't get it. Maybe at one point, far long ago, 6 months or 3 years or wherever, when you were baptized, okay. But somewhere along the line, things transformed and returned maybe back to how they were before. Self somehow came up and asserts its presence and its even dominance. So this is what I want to examine today. Where are you standing today? How are you living today? Where are you at today? It's a daily matter. This struggle is a daily struggle. But in this struggle, we're actually promised some very powerful sources of help, divine sources of help, to enable us and to help us to do that. So I'm not outlining the hardship of this so I can, discourage you, but we really need to realize, brothers and sisters, practically speaking, what we're in. We need to be honest with ourselves, above all. So this principle, to glorify God above all, to surrender self, this hard thing to accomplish, to do, then the natural thing that flows from this is, okay, well, how do we do it? It's hard. What we're seeing, it's very important. It's vital. We're seeing Christ demonstrated. Okay, it's hard. It's very difficult. So how is it accomplished? How do we surrender ourselves? What is it that God has provided for us to actually help us accomplish this particular task? Because this is really the only principle that we can live by. We saw that in the example of Christ. Now, how do we do this surrender? What we really need to understand is the gift and the power that God gave us, the power of the will, or the power of choice. When we make a choice, and particularly a commitment, this is really the governing power in man's nature, the ability and freedom. And it cost God so much. The whole plan of salvation is because part of it is actually to work and preserve man's freedom of choice, the power of decision, or the power of the will. Everything, actually, someone said everything depends on the right action of the willpower, choice power. See, we can't change our heart. We can't just give to God our affections. But what we can do is we can choose to serve him. That's a choice we can make. So it's very important to understand the power of the will, or the power of choice that has been given to mankind. This element in the great controversy actually helps us understand so much, and helps us understand how incredibly powerful this gift that God gave us. Honestly, I believe outside the gift of his son, the greatest gift that God had given his creatures is this freedom, this liberty to choose, the freedom to choose. So when we understand that we can exercise that in a very intelligent and a very effective way. Many times we make our choices based on how we feel, how we have information based on our senses, on our emotions. This is how we judge certain situations. But when we can make a choice, not necessarily based on that, we make a choice based on what's revealed in the word, where we can actually surrender our choice. We surrender ourself. We surrender to God, regardless of our feelings, regardless of our emotions. We can actually give him the one thing that he has given us, this power of choice, or the will power. He then works in us to will and to do according to his good pleasure. That's the verse we just read there in Philippians. God works in us, his Spirit pleased with our hearts to bring us to that point where we can make the choice to give him our will. He then works in us to will and to do according to his good pleasure. This is how it works. This is the mechanics of it. Because when that happens, then you live in this way, surrender to him, making his glory your motive, living by faith. You surrender to God. That is what pleases God. And that's actually what puts us back in harmony with him as things were in the Garden of Eden before the fall of man. When you give your will over to God, that actually gives God the right and opens the door to then he can work in you in supernatural, miraculous way. It's more than just about, pleasing God. Well, this is what God wants, we better do it. No, God can actually work in you in supernatural ways that can actually give you an experience and a satisfaction that is not possible when you're trying to live by self. Didn't Jesus say, I have come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly? How is it that you can have more abundant life? By surrendering, by glorifying God, by pleasing him, because it's his pleasure to give you that abundant life. So it's about living an experience that God designed and intended for us. Living for self is a miserable existence. It is a miserable, miserable existence. And many Christians, sadly, in their Christian walk, they have still a miserable existence. That's what I'm challenging. How are you actually living? Are you in conflict? Are you having an unnecessary struggle because somewhere along the line you've neglected, you've fallen off the track, or you've forgotten to live daily by this principle of living by faith? What that means is to surrender self to please God, not your will, but his will, not informing your Christian walk by your senses and your feelings and your emotions, not basing it on that, as Thomas did. This we're putting all these things together. That's what Paul meant when he says, I live by the faith of the Son of God. So God works in this supernatural way to give you this abundant life, doing his good pleasure. And this is how actually God transforms us. This is how God, transforms our very nature. We come under the control of the Spirit of Christ. So making our feelings subordinate to our power of choice. So the devil has actually reversed this for people. This is what we were talking about in a practical way. The devil, for the most part, causes people to judge our standing with God based on our feelings. When we don't feel too well, we begin to doubt. When we're feeling a little bit oppressed and down, we begin to question. And when we make our feelings prominent, we reach a point, like Eve did, where we can depart from the principle of living by faith, living to please God, and we start consulting our feeling and end up trying to please self, subconsciously, slowly, little by little at the beginning. And so this is why we are to live by this principle of faith that pleases God, to glorify God. Not my will, his will, self-surrender. So very important to make this point as well. This is a practical matter that applies to every person. No matter what you believe, what you know, what doctrine it is, many times we rest in our knowledge of doctrine. I know this idea and I understand this teaching and I know the truth about this matter and the other matter. All our knowledge really amounts to nothing when it comes to this particular point if we fail to apply this principle and live by. We're not saved by knowledge. If we fail to make the transition from just the information in our head to apply it practically in our life, then that knowledge in our head amounts to nothing. God only sends us really this knowledge to aid us to reach this point where we can give him our will so that his will becomes ours. So it's very important to trust in the one thing of the entire surrender of self daily to God. Nothing can rob us of this power of choice. All the devil, all his angels, they cannot, whatever doubt, whatever trouble, whatever turmoil they throw your way, they can never steal from you the power of choice. That is your God-given right that God has promised. God has pledged it on authority of his throne that he will protect this right, this freedom of choice. Even Jesus' death on the cross was to maintain and protect this power of choice. God respects this precious gift that he gave us, this power of choice. So when we recognize that, the power that is contained in it, when we understand it and the commitment that we can make, and to allow this commitment to override our feelings, our emotions, our senses, whatever happens around us, and we make a commitment. a heartfelt surrender and commitment. Lord, this is how I'm going to live my life, no matter what. When that principle defines our experience, we are living by faith that pleases God, then we can actually experience a supernatural outcome. This is what Jesus went through. Now, it's not easy, it's hard, it's challenging, but it's not impossible. How is it with you and me? This is the question. We need to take our pulse, check daily, today. How am I living? So another question that's also an outflow of that people ask usually is, well, how do I know if I've surrendered my will to God? You ever wondered about that? How do I know? How can I really know that I've really surrendered? So that sounds good what you're saying. That makes sense. I want to live by that principle, and I believe I've done it, but I'm not sure if I've fully done it or not. So how do I really know? You ever wondered about that? Good question. Now, sometimes when we have particularly also certain experiences that cause us to question or doubt, we start thinking, okay, what happened? Or am I really walking with the Lord? Have I really surrendered fully, or is something missing? Why did this happen? Maybe this happened because I neglected this, or I'm not really fully surrendered. And all these ways and means that the devil brings in, to cause doubt. And we ask this question. It's a good question. It's a good question to ask. How do I really know? Now, there are some scriptural answers. Let's look at a few of them and see about how do I know if I've surrendered to God. Because, when situations come that reveal certain things to us that we need to take into account, it causes some of these questions to rise up. So, Romans 8 and verse 16, here's what we're told. The Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. This has to do with what we're talking about. The Spirit bears witness with our spirit. How does the Spirit bear witness? You see, we have a peace within. We have an inner assurance. Now, does that mean we are consulting our feelings? No, we're trusting in God's promises. Remember, faith, if you look at faith carefully, you find faith is actually trusting in God's word implicitly, even when it doesn't feel like it. When we surrender our will, when we make that decision of giving everything to God, the Bible says the Spirit bears witness with our spirit that we are sons of God. How does the Spirit bear witness? It's very important to remember something. The Bible talks about the fruit of the Spirit. There is a list there of the fruit of the Spirit. Now, when we give our lives to Christ, when we surrender our lives to Christ, He fills us with His Spirit. The presence of the Spirit, we are told, the fruits reveal if the Spirit is present or not. And as Jesus said, by the fruits you shall know them. And so by the fruits of the Spirit, we can know if we have that witness in ourselves or not. The Spirit bears witness, not just by giving us this assurance, this confidence, but we actually see a practical manifestation, a change in what our life looks like practically. The Spirit is still bearing witness. That's part of the Spirit bearing witness. You see, the Spirit bearing witness it's not just you being convinced very strongly of something, but it actually demonstrates itself in your experience, in your life. So here's the practical questions to ask. Are we loving Christians, or are we short-tempered, grumpy Christians? Are you like that? Am I like that? If we are actually, short-tempered, grumpy Christians, or all the different things that we experience, we really need to ask then ourselves the question, have I surrendered this morning? Not 3 years ago or 6 months ago. Have I surrendered this morning? Am I living by this principle to glorify God today? Or am I back to some of these old habits? Is self rising up and I didn't really notice? How is my experience? So the Spirit bears witness with our spirit. Now let's look at another one. There's a few of them. Let's look at another one. This is in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 21. He says, Beloved, if our hearts condemn us not, then have we confidence toward God. So John here is saying that we're to examine something. We're to examine our heart. If our hearts condemn us not, then we have confidence with God. The only person that can really answer this examination properly is really you alone with God. He knows the heart best, because the heart can end up deceiving us ourselves. But you can deceive others, but we know our heart better than anyone else. But God knows our heart best. So the only way to really know the true condition of the heart is in that silent time of prayer, searching your heart before the Lord, asking the Lord to examine the heart. And the Spirit of the Lord brings to mind, there's that bit there in your heart. You need to surrender. You haven't surrendered yet. If you want that full surrender. And when we search our hearts before God, like in this way, as the Spirit impresses us, we can say, as John says, if our hearts condemn us not, then we have confidence with God. Because if you pray to God and ask him, and he shows you, he will show you what's missing. The Bible actually tells us that. That's a function. That's the work of the Spirit to reveal to us the things that we need to surrender. And many times, and I'm sure you've had this experience, you'd be praying and something will come to mind. It's like the Lord says, look, there is that part that you think you surrendered everything, but there is that part there that hasn't been surrendered. And how we react, how we respond makes all the difference. If you truly want to give all to God, then the response and the reaction is, yes, surrender all. Yes, Lord, thank you. There might be a struggle, but I want that more than, the lack of that experience with you, and you surrender that. You give that. You hand it over to God. How you react, how you respond can make all the difference. This is what I'm saying. It's a personal, very private, intimate heart examination, examining our hearts before God. Lord, have I surrendered everything? I want to make sure. That's a good prayer to pray. If you're wondering, if you're asking, oh, look, how do I know? Ask the Lord, pray, Lord, have I surrendered everything? Is there something missing? Is there some area in my life that I'm still holding on to? Lord, please bring it to my attention. And be ready, because God will answer that prayer. And the difficulty is not that God's showing us the answer. The difficulty many times we find is we don't want to give up that particular area and that particular component. Make sure we've surrendered all. This is a daily matter, brothers and sisters. I have every confidence, according to the promise of God, that when you ask and pray this prayer, God will answer this prayer for you. That's his promise. Here's another beautiful text. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 17. Have I surrendered self or not? Here's what it says. Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. We all know this verse, right? But here is a description of those people that are in Christ. Old things are passed away. All things are become new. So, look at your heart, look at your walk, look at your experience. How do I know if I've surrendered myself to Christ? Ask yourself this question. Have the old things passed away? Or are they still there? Is everything new, or some things are looking a little bit like their old stuff still kind of revived? That's a question we need to ask ourselves daily. When David prayed, it says, Lord, create in me a new heart and renew a right spirit within me. David was praying and asking for that. Is the life we're living every day the life of the new creature, or there are old things? That is the means, brothers and sisters, of examining and seeing our heart. Have we truly surrendered all? That is how we can answer the question, have I given all to the Lord? Or are there little bits here and there? Because when trials come and we manifest something or other, that we might have not surrendered or we're struggling with for a while, that is to reveal to us, have we truly fully surrendered, or are there still little bits left over that God is trying to show when he allows certain situations to develop, to try us, to reveal things to us? Because God is in the business of making sure that we get to the kingdom. And we can only get there if we live by this principle. So God is not going to cheat and wink at something if you desire to fully give your heart to him and surrender, and you say, oh, it's okay, well, let some things pass. No, he will show you what's missing. He will show you the areas that we really need to surrender if you truly want that fully. So these situations that develop, that many times we face, that seem to be puzzling, many times they're actually designed by God to show us, have we truly fully surrendered everything, or there are some bits and pieces that are still missing? That's a new creature. When the Spirit of God takes possession of the heart, it actually transforms the entire life. The thoughts are changed. If you look at your experience when you were born again, or when you were converted, things change drastically. So I'm not asking if that had happened to you, that's great. I'm asking, since that time, in your journey since, when you have traveled the road for a while since then, how is it with you today? You see, so many times we put confidence in the past, in how things were in the past, not realizing that we grow, we change. We are to change for the better, but sometimes we change and we retrograde. We change for the worse. Sometimes old habits creep up again. And this is why I'm saying, okay, let's take a check. Let's just make sure we're standing where we need to be. The transformation of the Spirit of God in the life transforms the thoughts. Peace, love takes the place of anger and malice, and strife. Joy takes the place of sadness. These are evidences of the presence of the Spirit of God. And all of that is reflected in the person's appearance, in the countenance. There's people, like, if you remember the story of Stephen, they looked at him and they could see that, his face was lit up like an angel. Do people see something in us? This is our experience reflected on the outside. Or is it just something that we hold to theoretically and people look at us and they see, oh, this guy, I'm glad I'm not like him or like her. How is it with us? Daily examination. Do we reflect the light of heaven in not just our behavior, even in our countenance, even in our appearance? So this is what a new creature looks like. Is this me today? Now, have I surrendered today? Has the Spirit taken possession of my heart for this day? Because the blessing, brothers and sisters, comes by faith when we surrender all to God. This is not something I'll try and work hard at and say, okay, let me practice in the mirror. Let me make sure I get my act better. No, let me ensure that, I put on all the right things that I need to do and control myself better. It's not done by that. It's done by faith. When we surrender ourselves, the decision we can make is not try harder to do better. The decision is to give our will to Christ and by faith believe his promise, allow his Spirit full control. We then receive that blessing. It's by faith. It's living by this principle when the soul surrenders itself to God. So we saw how that is done. That is through the exercise of the power of the will, the power of choice, because everything really depends on what choice, what commitment we make. Now notice, I'm emphasizing choice, not the choice to try and do the right things that we read about, but the choice. Number one, the only really valid choice that we have is to surrender and give our will, our choice, hand it over to say, God, I want you to take charge instead of me and self and serving self by my senses, by all these things that come in. I want to choose you, your will, your glory, your will, not my will. When we make that choice, brothers and sisters, when we make that commitment truly and believe it fully, and by faith believe that God actually does something, when that occurs, the Spirit can then work miraculous transformations in our life. Look, if you've been converted, you'd experience that. Is it your experience today? Now. So that's why it's so important to understand the right action of the will and the right place of the will and the right exercise of the will. So many people exercise their willpower in the wrong direction. They think exercising the willpower and choice power is about trying to do all the things that we know are good and well. But the number one choice is to hand over and give the will to God, surrendering all to God. So, like I said, don't think of it as an event that's just happened in the long past, when you're baptized. It's a fresh daily experience that needs to be renewed daily. If it's not so, then we are in grave danger. There are many perplexities, there are many challenges, there are many dangers and problems that exist in the church and in our experience. And the reason, to a large degree, is because of this lack of daily surrender. Self is not fully surrendered, self is not fully dead, because everyday self is struggling for the mastery. A vital question to ask, a series of questions really to ask, and a vital examination to perform. Living by this principle daily. If you have it right, everything falls into place. Even those things that are perplexing and puzzling, they will fall into the right place. You will know how to navigate and deal with them because Christ accomplished that. And he is the one who is then in you to will and to do of his good pleasure, regardless of the circumstances without. So this is, like I said, a serious challenge. When we surrender ourselves to Christ, surrender all, many times we also fall into the trap of still consulting with our feelings. Should we consult our feelings to determine if we're surrendered or not? The answer is really no. But many times we end up doing that subconsciously, indirectly. In other words, depending on how we feel, we judge our spirituality for that day. Remember those days when you wake up and you don't feel the best, and you feel, oh, maybe I don't know where I stand with God, and your spiritual walk for that day might have not been where it should be because the feelings affected and influenced how you perceived God was looking at you. You judge your standing with God based on how you feel. And look, feelings are so fickle. Sometimes you don't have a good sleep, you wake up and you're not in a good mood. If your spiritual walk is dependent on that, if your standing with God is dependent on that, that is really a very miserable experience. It's like a yo-yo effect. So it depends on your feelings. This is how you have a spiritual high or a spiritual low depending on your feelings. Brothers and sisters, we need to ditch that. That is not a joyful living abundantly. Like Jesus says that they might have life and have it more abundantly. Christ wants us to live by an altogether higher, better principle. It's called living by faith, not feelings. Even though we say it, we know we live by faith, we ought to live by faith. So many times we end up actually practically living more by feeling than by faith. That's why I'm asking this question. We have to distinguish between the two. Impressions and feelings are not the sure evidence that God is necessarily leading the person. Because Satan, when you don't realize his tactics, Satan can give feelings and impressions. You realize that? Satan can play with our emotions. Feelings and impressions can come from the enemy. Satan himself can do that. Now, when you realize that, because there's so many people, you know, I meet them, you meet them too. They say this in different ways, but it amounts to, I was impressed to do this, or I was impressed to do that, or I was impressed to do the other thing. And many times the implication is that impression is coming from God. That's the implication. But guess what? Satan will, if he's not suspected, he also will give feelings and impressions. You realize that? So it's very important to not just function and act based on feelings and impressions. The Christian lives by this one principle that we found, living by faith. That is giving glory to God, surrendering our will to God, not my will, but his will. Our impressions should be judged by whether it's God's will or not. Does it glorify God or not? Not just because I felt like doing it, or I got an impression. Because the devil can manipulate our feelings and our emotions. People can do that. Okay, we can manipulate each other's feelings and emotions by certain things we say. Can you imagine then the devil, how much more he can do that? Because many times the devil will give us the feeling and the impression of we don't feel very worthy. We don't feel very spiritual. And so what we end up thinking, we're not really good Christians, and we start consulting with these feelings, with these impressions, and we will end up having such a terrible experience for that day in our spiritual walk, because we base our standing and our perception of our standing with God on feelings and emotions. So fickle, something so fickle. And then the devil sees, we fall into our old habits, saying, okay, sorry, you started off as Christian, good, just give you some time. Okay, now, and he ends up controlling us, and we end up with this sad Christian experience, which is nothing really of what God intends. It's not really a Christian experience. We have a profession, we think we're somewhere and we're somewhere else, and we have this inner conflict. So there is a good test, and that test is consulting what God says, not our feelings and our emotions. As soon as we begin to consult with our feelings, we're on dangerous ground. And you would have had this experience. I'm sure you can relate to what I'm saying. You felt good one day, and you feel, oh man, heaven smiles at me. God is smiling at me, and you feel so good. And the other day, you don't feel as good, and you feel, oh, I'm out of favor with God. This is dangerous ground, brothers and sisters, when we start doing that, because God's love towards us does not change based on what we feel on one day or another day. God's love and promises towards us don't change according to our feelings. The devil uses our feelings, which we have learned to trust many times, to judge certain situations. The devil uses those against us. We have to be mindful of his tactics, and he can give us a hard time that way. But if we have understood the principle that we're to live by, surrendered our will, and through whatever feelings we might experience that the devil might throw at us, we can see that God's promises and God's love towards us is constant. We can have a much different experience. So it's not wise to just look at our emotions and try and judge our spirituality by our emotions and our feelings. There's so many times that people do that. A vital point to keep in mind, this principle, to understand the distinction between feeling, emotion, and living by faith, by this principle that we're talking about of glorifying God. Feelings in the Garden of Gethsemane told Jesus one thing. He did not consult with his feelings or give in to his feelings or let his feelings determine his decision or his standing with God. He trusted in God, even at the time on the cross when he felt forsaken of God. He's telling you what he felt like. He still trusted in God regardless of the feelings and the emotions that he experienced. He lived by that principle. So now God here, to to also, I want to mention this. God is not saying here, do away with feelings altogether. Feelings are bad. No, feelings are God-given, but feelings should not be trusted as the primary source of information in making spiritual decisions. That's the point, really. And many times, because everything in life we base on our feelings, our perceptions, we inevitably, many times in our spiritual walk, end up applying the same principle and go by the same thing by our feelings and by our emotions. It's a subconscious matter. If you've done it for for years, it happens automatically. It's like you're on autopilot. Beware. Do not do that. Satan can have an unnecessary advantage over us when that happens. So many people are victims of this tactic. How is it with you today? How is it with you throughout this day? Currently, in your Christian experience, how is it with you? Where do you stand? So, if you haven't really fully surrendered your heart, you're having this up and down experience. The victory is assured when you fully surrender to God. If you're not having victory, this is a good indicator. This is where you need to look at, am I fully surrendered? If I'm not having victory, then the question to ask is, well, am I fully surrendered? Is this something that I have not given to God, that I have neglected to give to God? Is there something that I'm still holding on to? And if you're not having victory, you really need to spend more time on your knees. Spend more time in prayer, in the most holy place. Don't just rush in and out. We are at a serious time in Earth's history, brothers and sisters. Prayer is where we go into the very audience of God. Focus your attention on the things that really matter, the eternal things. Spend more time in the presence of God, letting God examine your heart so that you can see, why am I struggling in this area as far as victory over sin? Have I really surrendered all, or am I living in this conflict and not really realizing it? There are people in the world who don't even profess Christianity. Some of them have, to a certain extent, the ability to exercise self-control and actually, control their spirit or control their attitude and have a certain control of some of these negative emotions and outbursts of anger. There's self-help books and things of how you can control these things in the world. Now, these things happen not necessarily with any help from heaven. This is the exercise of human willpower in the area of trying to control oneself by their own effort. And they have a certain measure of success. Now, if this happens, then this is really a rebuke to us Christians who have a supernatural source of help to enable us to truly overcome these besetments in our character. And we end up still struggling with the same thing on and on and on and on. Long after we've converted, we're on the Christian walk and we're still being beset and struggling with the same failures. We have such a greater help. So this is a reminder and really a rebuke for us. So when we're asking these questions, I know these are tough questions, these are hard questions, but somebody's got to ask them. Somebody has to say it. And I'm saying this to me too. I'm not saying this because I'm there or I've arrived. I'm saying this to all of us, brothers and sisters. Let us truly be what God wants us to be. It's an important thing. It's a very, very serious matter to examine. Like we said, it's the very essence of the teachings of Christ. That we looked at earlier, self-surrender, this daily Christian walk, this victory over the besetments of sin, attitude, the character, and the spirit that we manifest. Just because you know the truth about the Father and the Son does not automatically make you surrendered. Okay? Just because you might know present truth does not mean automatically mean you're fully surrendered. So it's a vital thing to ask. Let's apply this principle. Let's live, brothers and sisters, by the way that truly pleases God. Doesn't matter how many times you've been baptized, doesn't matter how long you've been a member, all of that does not prove that you are surrendered and walking with Jesus today. That is really what matters. Today, how are you walking? Doesn't matter how much you know all the past, whatever. Now, today, where are you now? Sadly, we fall into this trap so many times of trusting in these things. What I know, where I belong, my membership, my baptism, or my double baptism, or triple, or however many times one has been baptized. And I'm not trying to mock that, but we trust in these things: information, doctrine, belonging. I belong to this group. I'm with this ministry. I'm with this church. I have this membership. And we trust in these things, and we forget the most important principle: living today, daily, by faith, surrendering self to the glory of God. So when we adopt this principle, how is this principle strengthened? How does God strengthen this principle in our life. So if we adopted this principle, say, okay, what you're saying is good and well, yes, I live by this. How does God train us to live by this in a more consistent way? Because you look at the life of Christ, you see that when Christ was tested the most is when you see this principle manifest the most. So when principles are challenged, actually that's a means of strengthening them, because that's the test, that's the place of growth. Trials can actually strengthen and challenge that principle. So are we going to hold on to it more in a trial, and therefore our grip on it is stronger, or are we going to let go? God allows trials, situations, even challenges to come our way in order to strengthen and train us. The devil sees to it that he will get every opportunity to challenge this principle that you or I may have adopted. So it's important. We're living now in a time of peace. We're living in a time when the winds have not really been released yet. And even though I know there is mounting trouble, but we're still, to a large degree, still living at peace. And many times in our walk, that's why we're looking at this, we experience a very difficult time in our spiritual walk. And we come to a point where we're almost close to giving up sometimes because of the things that we go through. And these, brothers and sisters, are tests to challenge what principle are we living by. And what we need to do is to examine ourselves, have our fully surrendered to God. Is God trying to show me something that I've missed, that I've not surrendered, that is causing me to experience this trial in a more severe way? It's causing me to have this struggle. It's causing me this contradiction or this conflict in my walk that is giving me so much headache. And we really need to do that on our knees. These trials are the building blocks for the time that is coming ahead. There is a serious time that is coming ahead. So this time now of peace, God is using to strengthen these principles in us. God is bringing us closer and closer as we see certain areas that cast a light on the darker portions of our heart, the parts that we're not aware of, these areas, these challenges. God is preparing us to stand in the greatest test of all, when this principle will be tested, where our lives will depend on standing for this principle or not. Most of us are not at that stage yet. We're not tested on whether it's a life or death issue. And to be honest, some of us are not prepared to really face death, to stand for principles. So God is preparing us at little things here and there to help us grow, to get to that place. Some of us will face this. The book of Revelation shows us very, very clearly. So if you're having a hard time in your walk now, if you're having a struggle, if you're finding it really hard, how are you going to do when the going gets really tougher? So this is where we need to examine our hearts now, brothers and sisters. We need a faith that will endure delay, weariness, and even hunger, we are told. We don't think about hunger when we have 3 meals a day. Maybe we're starting to think about it a little bit when we see some of the shops and the supplies are running out. Do we have a faith that will endure weariness, delay, and even hunger? Now is where we are to adopt this principle and make it a habitual way of living. And these little trials are the way that God is training us and teaching us to hold on strong so that we can face the really big trials. Look, the world is getting ready for what's coming. The people that were, the enemy and his plans for evil in the world, they're preparing, they're prepping, they have an agenda, they have a plan. The Bible reveals it, the Satan is wanting to deceive the whole world. What are we doing to prepare? How are we preparing? It's preparing by daily living by this principle, becoming so accustomed to it that it's like on autopilot. It's like a subconscious. This is how we operate. This is our default setting. Is this your experience? Is this my experience? We have to prepare, brothers and sisters, seriously to stand for when that great day comes. So anyway, our last text expresses this thought. This is Jeremiah chapter 12 and verse 5. When we look up and we say, Lord, this is hard. Jeremiah had this experience. Lord, why is this happening? Here is how God comforted him. Jeremiah 12 and verse 5. If thou hast run with the footmen, and they have wearied thee, then how canst thou contend with horses? And if in the land of peace, wherein thou trustest, they wearied thee, then how wilt thou do in the swelling of Jordan? What a beautiful, powerful text, really. This is God's answer to Jeremiah. So, in essence, God really told him, Jeremiah, take courage. Be of good cheer. It's actually going to get tougher. It's going to get worse, which is why these principles are tested now. God didn't say this to Jeremiah to discourage him. God didn't say this to Jeremiah to turn him off. God is telling him, Jeremiah, listen, don't give up now. There's actually greater trial coming, and I'm with you now to teach you, to encourage you, to help you to live by this principle daily. Trust in me, surrender your will to me. I will carry you through to what is coming. God doesn't allow these things to happen to us to torture us. God is doing this to help us, brothers and sisters, to develop that character, that attitude, that experience where we can stand to him and face for him and face death. We stand with God no matter what. No matter what happens. The only way that's accomplished is that day by day we're living by this principle, living by faith, surrendering all to Christ. So I pray that what was shared today challenges you. I know it challenges me to search deeper in our hearts, in those areas that we don't necessarily examine, and really see, am I truly fully surrendered to Christ today? Is my will entirely given over to Christ? Am I living for his glory? Am I ready for that time that is coming when our faith will have to endure all these things, delay, weariness, hunger even? So as we have a prayer, may this be the prayer of your heart, each and every one of us, because God is calling us higher. God is calling us to live by this principle, that is to glorify his name. So I'll invite you to join me and we'll have a word of prayer to close together. Father in heaven, we are so thankful for this challenge, for this higher calling to truly live by faith. Father, this is impossible for us. You have alerted us in your word that you desire to accomplish this miracle for us, to be renewed, to be made a new creature in Christ. I pray that you will strengthen each one of us to truly surrender our will, to exercise our willpower, our choice power, not to try and do different things, but above all, to give ourselves to you, to make this commitment, this deep, heartfelt commitment to live by your principles, the principle of faith, to live to please you. Not our will, but thy will be done. Please let your spirit mold and shape and influence our character and transform our nature to be made anew, that the old things might indeed pass away and that all things might become new, that we might have this experience that you desire for us, each and every one of us, to have. Thank you so much. I know that this is a serious and heart-searching challenge, but I pray, Lord, that your spirit will provide that which we all need the most, each and every one of us, in our trial and our difficulty, the areas in our life where we struggle, that you will bring healing, restoration, and renewal for each and every one of us. We ask this with thanksgiving in Jesus' name and for his sake. Amen. I pray you were blessed by this video. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, like, turn notifications on, and most importantly, share this video with others. May God the Father richly bless you in Jesus.